Hello, my name is Pratibha. I've been working for the last 17 years, 14 of which were my years as a journalist. I used to work as news presenter, producer, copy editor at Nepal's biggest private TV station, which was Kantipur Television in Kathmandu for 13 years. I believe that I had the most interesting years working in the newsroom because I was able to cover some of the major breaking stories going out of Nepal. The 10-year civil war was going on in Nepal when I started working as a journalist. So by the time the Maoist rebels entered the peace process, I had learned that unfortunately tragedy makes the biggest moments for the news. I also covered 2 rounds of the Constituent Assembly elections, and that laid the foundation for a new constitution for Nepal. I covered the endless brownout hours where Nepali people learned to make adjustments with living with just 4 hours of electricity per day. I covered the earthquake of 2015 that killed 9,000 people in Nepal. I also covered India's blockade of Nepal, during which time Nepal suffered severely from lack of oil, fuel, and food supplies. So what I have learned from those years of coverage is that news never stops and only moves faster when there's more unsettling things happening around us. And that's where our responsibility as journalists come in. To tell a story well is not just a responsibility, I feel, but it is also a moment to shine in your profession. So I will be using this video as an opportunity to take you back to the basics of news writing, and then we will discuss other relevant forms as well. So let's begin with spot news. Spot news is what occurs and is reported immediately. This form of coverage is the first step to writing news, and we all have done it in some form or the other. While it may sound simple, writing a spot story can sometimes be tricky, but not if you have the elements in place. Even as journalists who have been working for a number of years in the trade, it is easy to forget the basics sometimes. So let's take a few minutes to get back to the basics of news writing. So the lead or the intro. This is the hook that tells the reader what the story is about and includes the most important of the 5 W's and 1 H. That is who, what, where, when, and how, as we all know. Try to keep your lead short, fewer than 20 words. A good lead entices the reader to continue reading. In a hard story, the lead is usually written in 1 sentence. It is the first sentence of the story that gives the most important information about the event. This is often called a summary lead, and I'll give you an example for this. The World Health Organization is warning that people who have had COVID-19 are not necessarily immune by the presence of antibodies from getting the virus again. However, a news story can have a soft lead, which is more creative and descriptive. Here's how that might sound. Beaches are reopening at a swift rate in some of the United States' sun-soaked southern states. Backup for the lead. The lead should be supported in later sentences with facts, quotes, and statements that substantiate the information in the lead. Lead quote. The first quote that backs up the lead is called the lead quote. It is usually the strongest quote in the story. It supports the concept in the lead, but it does not repeat the same words. Make sure to attribute quotes to proper sources to say who is speaking. Background. Is there any history or background your reader needs to know to understand how a problem or action occurred? Then you must include it. Impact. Whenever possible, your story should explain how the news affects the people in your audience. The impact sentence or paragraph should answer this question. Not all stories can show a direct impact on readers, but they should all have a clear paragraph explaining the reason for the story. Ending. The most common type of ending includes one of these elements. Future action, which should include statement or quote that summarizes previous information. Elaboration or additional statements, quotes, or details related to the main issue. Avoid summary endings that repeat what you have already said. If you follow these steps in your writing, they will help you structure your story. It will also be easier for your audience to understand your story. So alongside with doing TV coverage, I was also writing for a German press agency during those days. I wrote for a German press agency, better known as DPA, for 7 years, during which I covered politics, economy, climate change, disasters, mountaineering, tourism, culture, and anything important and interesting happening in Nepal. And the form I just talked about was the one I followed day in, day out to cover stories going out of Nepal. Writing for international media is a slightly different piece of cake. It can be similar to writing for TV with the pressure deadlines, but it also uses very organized form of writing. And the steps we just talked about would be helpful for you to follow if you're writing for an international audience, especially providing a background. Never assume your audience knows the context, and always write simply. As I always say, the best stories are told in the simplest language. The best stories are also those that are written tight and come with a clear focus. So I'm going to spend some time talking about focus now. When you start to write a news story, the first thing you do is to find your focus. Focus helps you decide what you must include in your story and what you can leave out. Focus also helps you keep control of the story to tell what you think is most important to your listener, viewer, or reader. So focus helps you decide what information is important and what is not needed in order to tell a compelling story, one that people will be interested to look at, to listen to, or to read. So your audience only knows as much as you tell them. So leave out information that does not help you tell your story better, or leave out information that does not help your audience understand the story better. You do not need to put in every fact you know, just those facts that support the angle of your story, the way you have decided to tell it. Focus helps you decide what order to set out the facts in so they lead your audience through your story logically. The other important tip in organizing your news story is to know what information to provide when. Your lead or intro always needs to include who, what, and why. Who is the main character of your story? Sometimes there is more than one who in a story. What is the central action of your story? This contains an active verb indicating action and emotion of the story. Why is the because or motivation? Good stories involve tension, suspense, or conflict. For example, this intro clearly has who, what, and why and captures interest immediately. Britain's Prime Minister Boris Johnson will be back at work on Monday after recovering from coronavirus, a Downing Street spokeswoman says. Once you have these answers, you're ready to start writing your news story. To recap, a focus lead or intro contains a single declarative sentence, an active verb. The subject will be a person or people. It will be based on research. It will contain a cause and effect relationship. It will be specific. Just as finding the focus of your story is important, so is putting your story into context. Every story must answer why it is important, why we care about it, and context helps us do this. So make sure you include context in the form of background in your stories. For instance, stories on unrest in a country should always include the protesters' demand, how long the protests have been going on, and how many people have been killed. Stories about political issues should include the impact and repercussions of policies and decisions. To make your story credible and powerful, you will also need to substantiate your story with quotations. The general rule for quotes in stories is that they must be either from an important person or from an ordinary person saying something important or who has something extraordinary to say. Either way, all quotes must be meaningful. If you were using a quote for broadcast, however, you would not call it a quote. You would call it a soundbite. Writing for broadcast is a very different game from writing for other forms of journalism altogether. So it uses different terms as well. Well, in that sense, all forms of writing are different depending on its target audience. But how is writing for broadcast different then? Let's discuss. It is different because when you're writing for the audiovisual medium, you will write to the images or the video footage. If you're writing for the radio or for a podcast, you would be writing to the ear. We say writing to the ear because in broadcast, viewers do not have the opportunity to reread difficult passages. So our most basic task is to be clear in the first place. It means that we have to take steps to make sure our copies are direct, clear, and concise. This demands for a simpler writing structure. Your script has to have a clear beginning, middle, and end. We can break this down as lead, which is a short sentence capturing, previewing, and selling the essence of the story. It is similar to the function of a newspaper headline. Then you have the body. The bulk of the story usually presented in some semblance of chronological order through use of a narrative storytelling. And then you have the conclusion, which is a final thought bringing the story to a logical conclusion. The lead serves a preview function. The body of the story is the story view. And then the final sentence should review the story and give it a closure. Storytelling techniques. Broadcast writers popularly use what is known as the diamond approach. The story might start with a particular individual affected by the issue. Then it can zoom out to discuss the issue itself and its effect, then return to the individual discussed at the start of the story. This style of centering a story around people is also referred to as peopleizing the story. Conversational tone. Good broadcast scripts are written in conversational tones. It is written like a semi-formal, respectful conversation. One can think of it as a conversation with a friend. My editor used to say, imagine you're telling the story to your grandmother, someone you respect and someone who trusts you. So it works well for broadcasters to use we or you or us when speaking to the audience, like a real conversation you would have with somebody you know. Broadcasters also use contractions. So instead of could not, you could use couldn't. Active voice. Active voice works better than passive. It should be a dog bit Pratibha and not Pratibha was bitten by a dog. And why do we use active voice? Because passive sentences are harder to follow for the listener or the viewer. Active voice helps jump into the subject. Attribution. Since broadcast copy is written for the ear, how we attribute is very, very important. We place the attribution ahead of the statement, not following the statement as is done in newspapers. It is how we would report something being said by someone to another person. And here's an example. You would tell your grandmother, mother says she will help father cook some lemon rice for dinner, and not mother will help father cook some lemon rice for dinner, she said. So scripts for broadcast also use different templates, which we can discuss some other time. So apart from working for TV and wire services, I have also written for the past 16 years for the Kathmandu Post Daily. I have written book reviews, opinion pieces, short stories, and features. My favorite of these genres is feature stories, because I've been a fan of feature stories for really long, because I see them as being full of possibilities to do so much in one form. Feature writing offers more freedom and engages readers better than a straight news story. It explains how an event, problem, or trend affects the reader or community in human terms. It usually contains a description or narrative, exposition, and argument. The job of the feature writer is to grab the attention of the reader, shape the article so it does justice to the issue and people interviewed, preserve it in the reader's memory. But what could the content look like? It should be informative, that is facts, sources, and research. It should analyze and interpret, which is facts are organized and examined. Balance, which is opinion differentiated from fact, more than one side presented or acknowledged. Originality, which means your writing has to be fresh, insightful, and you have something new to say it in a different way and know what came out earlier and go beyond what was previously reported on the issue. People and quotes go a long way for a feature. Make your story lively, direct. Do not clutter your story with too many people, especially if they are saying the same thing, as it slows down the pace of the story and it increases the length. To add credibility to your story, bring in significant statements by a source who is an expert or has experience. Build up important characters' identity. Paraphrase convoluted quotes. Like all good news writing, feature writing also follows a list of steps. We could break them down as following. So the first one, the beginning, is research, like it is for all stories that you would work on. Shaping your idea, story dimension, planning and execution, organizing, wordsmithing, very, very important part of writing, and then editing, of course. I cannot stress enough the importance of research and editing to any writing that you do. Let that be your mantra. So we often talk about how the attention span of the readers or the viewers is increasingly growing shorter, and why we must consider shorter forms of journalism. But long form, particularly features, are here to stay, and it's worth trying to brush up your future writing skills. Now that I've mentioned the shortening attention spans, I think that sort of brings me to what I've been doing in the most recent years, because the last 4 years have been experimental for me professionally. So I've worked in the past 4 years as a communication specialist, 3 years of which were spent doing some production and writing work for BBC Media Action. I wrote blogs and other external facing content for the organization. I also produced short films and episodes for a debate show called Saja Sawal, which was Nepal's most watched debate while it was still being produced and was on the air. What I learned from my experience of moving between platforms is that in all of it, target audience is what really matters, and target audience is important and deserves utmost respect. So if we're saying that attention spans are shorter, then it also means that online demands shorter, clearer, concise, and easy to read sentences. And that's why we have longer versions of photo captions, which we also call flash essays. And here's an example. So while the following could serve as a photo caption, and let me read this out to you. Bimal Casey, 42, enjoys his first bottle of bubbles by the Fewa Lake, Pokhara. Bimal grew up in an orphanage and says it is the first time he has bought himself a bottle of bubbles, something he wanted to do as a child. So the same could easily be written with more description as a flash essay. And here's how it goes, and I'm going to read this out to you. 42-year-old Bimal Casey was sitting by the Fewa Lake in Pokhara when I met him. He looked up briefly from blowing bubbles as I sat down next to him to share his view of the lake. For several minutes he sat quietly, repeating the act of bringing the stem close to his mouth and then blowing large and small multicolored orbs. Then he broke his silence. I always wanted to do this as a kid, you know. I would see other kids do it and wonder, he said. I grew up in an orphanage, and when I started working, it was always about making the ends meet. I wash dishes in a restaurant now, and I'm quite busy most of the time. But we're having a slow morning today, and I decided to finally buy a bottle of bubbles, he said. I sat next to him and watched, quietly enjoying his little celebration. If you want, you can also add details to this about how many orphanages exist in Pokhara or other interesting details, depending on where you want to take the focus of your story. We've always heard the famous line that images can speak 1,000 words, and they do. Many photos need not even be captioned. But when text accompanies photos, they can become more important because they help you document facts. There are, of course, more interesting ways and more creative ways of writing a caption now, especially with the growth of citizen journalism. Your Instagram story could be anything from a word for a caption to a quote to a flash essay or just a list of hashtags. As you reflect on some of the basics I have brought to you today, remember you are the newsroom. Journalists like you across the world are working and thinking about stories round the clock. Every journalist is their own newsroom as they constantly plan and research, write, edit, and produce their stories. Thank you for joining me.